Is that okay? Can you hear me or not? No. Can or cannot? Alright. Bring my beard. Okay. Sorry, not Malaysian. My beard's a bit bigger. Holding it here? Okay. I can hold it if you want. Is that better? Okay. Okay, my talk today is on following the Sunnah versus following a Mazhab. Are they inconsistent? Firstly, I do speak very fast, and my wife can't understand me, let alone anybody else. So if you get confused, please put your hand up and interrupt me. I don't mind, and that's fine. If you don't get the point I'm making, put your hand up and interrupt me. But try and stick to the topic we're covering, because there's space for Q&A at the end, inshallah. What I want to do is cover a few topics in this talk. The first one is driving fiqh from the Quran and Sunnah. Then discover... Sorry. Is it clear? Is it better? And the differences in usul between the madhabs. And go through an example to explain what I mean by this. Then cover what is the purpose of a madhab, what is a mujtahid imam, why there's only 4 madhabs in taqleed, and to resolve differences and contradictions between madhabs and hadith. It's a lot to cover, and hopefully we'll get some benefit out of it. Before I start, I want to ask you this question and take a show of hands. Is adhering to or following a madhab, is it obligatory, recommended, permissible, disliked or prohibited? By your hands. Who thinks it's obligatory? Okay. Who thinks it's recommended? A little bit. Permissible? Disliked? Prohibited? Who didn't put up their hands? Okay. I want to take by the way, there's a lot of information on the slides. I'm not going to cover all of it, but it'll illustrate the points I'm making. I want to make a slight distraction first about Imam Suyuti. Imam Suyuti was a very major scholar. He studied from over 150 shuyukh and wrote over 500 books. His students said about him, he was the most knowledgeable scholar in his time on the hadith and associated sciences, knowledgeable narrators, including uncommon ones, the text of the hadith matan. He himself had told me they memorized 100,000 hadith. Memorizing 100,000 hadith. And he said, and this is not a boast from him, because the other scholars attested this is true in terms of his knowledge. There's not one in our time, on the face of the earth, from east to west, anyone more knowledgeable than me, is myself in hadith and the Arabic language. And Allah knows best. And he wrote lots of books on different subjects. Jama Jawame, 10-volume hadith book. Tafsir Jalalain, which most people will have seen and come across, which he completed Jaldin Mahalli's teacher's book in 40 days. And his book on the hadith sciences, Tadrib al-Rawi, Sharon Taqrib al-Nawawi. Now, Imam Suyuti claimed that he was capable of independent ijtihad, or his ijtihad mutlaq. This is the highest level of ijtihad. And he said, I did not mean by this that I was similar to one of the 4 imams, but only that I was affiliated mujtahid. That he could tarjih in madhab. I did not contravene Imam Nawawi's tarjih, i.e. his opinion of the madhab. And when I reached the level of ijtihad, I did not contravene al-Shafi school. So Imam Suyuti, who literally threw books out, threw volumes out, he authored books. But despite this, he was capable of ijtihad, but he never left the Shafi madhab. And this is an interesting point. Many scholars we have, Ibn Hajar Asqalani, if we go back to the madhabs, we see the scholars, they normally were affiliated to madhab. That was the general the rule, not the exception. That was the norm, not the exception. Is everybody understanding my accent still? I'm getting confused faces. Okay. All right. This is kind of a summary of how we derive fiqh. We have the Quran and Sunnah, the source texts. Okay? which is obligatory to believe in, the hadith and the ayahs of the Quran and ijma and other sources. Then we have this process in the middle called usul al-fiqh, which the scholars use as their rules and principles on how to derive the fatwa and fiqh. So they all start from the same source, the same ayahs of the Quran, the same hadith, like Ahkam, which I think you're studying here. They use a process of usul al-fiqh to derive the fatwa and fiqh. So what are the differences? Why doesn't everybody agree? If they're using the same source, why aren't they getting the same fiqh? Well, the usul al-fiqh differs. Firstly, we have the source material, the Quran and Sunnah. We have clear ayahs and unclear ayahs. We have the ayah says, do not backbite. It's quite clear what that means. Or there's no preference of an Arab over a non-Arab. These are quite clear. But it says, وَمُطَلِقَاتِ can't read it. يَتَرْبَصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهُنَّ ثَلَاثَ قُرُوء. Now the word quru means literally haid and tuhur. Menses impurity. Which one does it refer to? It's linguistics. And the madhabs of the Hanafis, this is the first topic they cover in their school books. Why they argue that it means one meaning and not the other. And the reason for this unclarity is language. The word ayn in Arabic, it means well and it means eye. It has two meanings. And there's many words in languages have two meanings. And you go to the books and they argue consistently why their views are stronger. But at the end of the day, there's two opinions. And you can't say this is absolutely correct and this is absolutely wrong. Or you have hadith which seem to be contradict one another. Like it says, whoever has an imam, prays behind imam, then the imam's recitation is his recitation. So does that mean you don't need to recite in your prayer? But then we have another hadith saying there's no salat for one who doesn't recite Surah Fatiha. So they seem to contradict. And how do we reconcile these contradictions? Well, it's the usul. It's a methodology we follow to reach the conclusion and the rulings. Now, the differences between the madhabs can be put down to a difference in usul and methodology in deriving fatwa from the source materials. This is very important. Each madhab is correct in and of itself according to its principles and usul it is chosen to derive its rulings. So, for example, the wa does mean conjugation, wa means and. Is it just for conjugation or does it denote choice between the items? This is important, for example, in the fidya for talaq. For oath, you break an oath. Do you have a choice or do you have to do an order? Is it order which is hardest for you first? And the scholars differ on these issues because of things like linguistics. And the scholars like Imam Shafi, who are masters in linguistics, they're closer to understanding this than we are. Or, for example, the Malikis, like the actions of Ahl Medina, they say that the people in Medina, they were the first to get the Sunnah revealed to them, and their actions are a form of hadith, a mutawatir hadith, in terms of they lived the Sunnah. They saw it and they observed it. So if they're doing something, and there's a hadith saying that it's prohibited, it's impossible because it contradicts. And we have a form of source. And the other mothers say, no, we don't believe that. We have the hadith, we have the text. Medina people prove, the people of Medina is not a proof. And this is a form of ijtihad. This is their conclusions they're reaching. But this is not arguing on the source material. They're arguing which source material takes preference and precedence over one another. Or the Hanafis and mafhum mukhalafa. Mafhum mukhalafa means understanding the opposite from a text. It's quite an intricate part, but it's a big difference between the Shafis and the Hanafis. And you see from these differences, a lot of differences in fiqh and conclusions arise. And it's not because they're different from the source material, but it's because they're different in the methodology they're approaching the material. Like the Hanbalis, they prefer the weak hadith. Not very weak, but Hasan hadith to qiyas. Or, for example, the Shafis and Hanafis disagree on hadith and ayahs. Which has preference? Can you use hadith to specify or limit an ayah of the Quran? These are very technical differences. And these are very specialist differences. They're not for the normal person to go to. But this is the reason the madhab is different in general. It's not the Quran and Sunnah we saw in the first place, but it's a sort of process they're doing to derive the materials. So like I said, each madhab is correct with respect to his application of its own set of usul principles. So we have to remember the four madhabs came before the hadith were collected. In fact, they said Imam Shafi was a person who caused the hadith collections to start 50 years after his death, because he gave precedence to using marfu hadith and hadith to be collected. So, and after, it wasn't the madhabs we follow nowadays, not the madhabs of Imam Shafi only. It is generally his new madhab, for example, the Shafi madhab in Malaysia, which is quite prominent here, with about 17 opinions from the old madhab. But the madhab that followed the Shafi madhab is based on Imam Shafi's sayings, but it's been codified centuries after him by Imam Ramli and Imam Nawawi. What does this tell us? All the hadith are collected now. But they've spent years and years and decades and centuries seeing what the Sahih hadith is, a Hasan, going through the narrations, going through the chains, and getting the Sunnah to a quality that we have now, that everything is collected, everything is accurate. And then they go through the madhab of Imam Shafi and they basically say, look, this ruling, do we change this ruling because it's hadith? Does this still follow? Can we basically say, can we change this ruling now because of this? Was this old opinion more accurate? Can we leave the madhab on this issue? And we have thousands and thousands of scholars doing this for centuries of this work. So when you follow a madhab, you're following an institution. You're not following a single scholar. You're following the madhab of Imam Shafi as understood by his successors and the scholars who follow that madhab. I want to go through an example, and this hopefully will clarify the issue a little bit. This statement here, which I'm going to read to you, was made by somebody who rejected the madhabs to an extent. He preferred to take a hadith and say, I'm going to reject the ruling. He said, Imam Shafi said, when a woman touches a man who is in a state of wudu, the wudu of the man breaks. However, this ruling of Imam Shafi contradicts the authentic saying of the Prophet. Narrated by Aisha, the Prophet ﷺ said, Prophet kissed one of his wives and went out for saying prayer. He did not perform ablution, and the hadith quoted in Sunnah Abu Dawud. Thus, a particular teaching of Imam Shafi contradicts the authentic saying of the Prophet. So I reject this specific ruling of Imam Shafi, who himself said, if I say something, then compare it to the Quran and Sunnah. If it agrees with them, accept it. And if it goes against them, then throw my saying against the wall and reject it. This is a saying of Imam Shafi. Thus, by rejecting the particular teaching of Imam Shafi, which contradicts authentic hadith, I am practically a better follower of Imam Shafi than those who call themselves Shafi. I'm sure you've heard things like this beforehand. People say statements like this. I want to go through the statement. And it's important that we understand this statement and his chain of arguments. Firstly, there's a divergence of view on this ruling in the first place. The scholars differ on the meaning of lams in أو لمست النساء, or you touched women. The Hanbalis and Malikis basically restrict invalidating wudu on deriving pleasure from contact, where the Shafi say any contact, accidental or not. And the Hanafis understood to mean conjugal relationships. The other madhabs, and there's 17 different opinions we studied in our first year of university on this issue. There are restrictions like it being hair or teeth not included as touching. Do your nails included, they're not included. Does a person mahram, if the person is underage or not. And all these understandings are linguistically based, or what do they mean lumps mean? And they argue, they take another ayah of the Quran and say lumps mean, in this context means this. And they say, no, lumps means this in another ayah. And they differ, and they both come with their proof. And everybody will come with their proof. So firstly, there's difference in opinion among all the madhabs. And apart from the Hanafis, they all accepted it meaning touching, skin-to-skin contact of some sort. And I've taken this response mainly from Sheikh Taha Quran. Sheikh Taha Quran is a Shafi scholar in South Africa. He's interesting because he studied in Deoband in India as a Hanafi, but he was a Shafi. So he's a specialist in the Shafi madhab, and his school in South Africa produces very good quality Shafi fuqaha. In fact, some call him Shafi Saghir because of his knowledge in the madhab. So I've taken this from him, because he wrote the answer to this question, which he's answered the response to this issue. He said the authenticity of this hadith has been questioned on many grounds. Firstly, who's Urwa, who's in the chain of narration? Does everybody understand about chain of narrations of hadith? Does everybody understand it? Anybody not understand? Want me to go through it? Okay. He said, who's Urwa? It was supposed to be Urwa Muzani, who's unknown, majhul. In hadith literature, they say if a person only narrates one hadith, he's majhul. We don't know who he is. We can't take hadith from him. And not Urwa ibn Zubair, who was a nephew and pupil of Aisha. So they said, firstly, we don't know who the narrator is. And then there's a break in the hadith between Habib and Urwa. Okay? And some doubted they even met. And some people even believe they confuse this hadith between another hadith about kissing not invalidating the fast, which was the hadith in question, with kissing not invalidating your wudu. So the scholars, the rule this hadith is not authentic firstly. Imam Bukhari, Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan, Al-Tirmidhi, Yahya bin Ma'ain, Abu Hatim al-Razi, Sufyan al-Thawri, Ad-Darqutni al-Bayhaqi. You may have heard these names. These are big muhaddith. These are classical muhaddithin from the scholars. And they all ruled is invalid. But as you may know, there's never a ruling which is consistent, which everybody agrees upon. And Ibn Abu Bar, he said it's Hasan. He said it's acceptable hadith. And Shaykh al-Bani said it was authentic, and he said it's inauthentic in 2 different books. So firstly, the hadith, unlike he claimed, is authentic hadith because it was Sunnah Abu Dawud, which, as you may know, Sunnah Abu Dawud is not a collection of authentic hadith entirely. Only Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim you can say there is. The other Sunnah contain mixed hadith, which are Sahih and Hasan and Da'if. And he wasn't convinced, Imam Shafi wasn't convinced by authenticity of the hadith, so he said, no, I'm not using this hadith to restrict my ruling. And this is consistent with the view of Ibn Mas'ud and Ibn Umar. Secondly, okay, that is basically the Shafi response to this issue. The other issue I'm going to get to later was the second statement, which was, if my saying contradicts the Quran and Sunnah, then reject it and throw it against the wall. I want to cover this in depth to understand what he meant by this, and more importantly, who is he addressing it to. Now, Shaykh Taha Quran also said, what is the purpose of Mazhab? And I'll read this in entirety because it's very important, and he brings up a lot of important points. The madhahib should not be construed as 4 walls that surround its adherents, preventing them from any kind of exit. Rather, it should be looked upon as guidelines which allow an individual to follow the sacred law with consistency under a well-revised framework strengthened by the minds of thousands of jurists over the past 14 centuries. Since the madhahib, or who he's saying the Shafi madhab, which he's a specialist of, is not 4 walls, departure from the school under certain circumstances has been permitted. The idea behind following madhahib is not to turn people into prisoners of the madhahib, but to rather facilitate practicing upon the Quran and Sunnah. No madhab has ever purported to be a replacement for the Quran and Sunnah, nor can it ever be so. The facility that a madhab provides is that of a systematic approach to the sources of our law, accompanied by the benefit of generation after generation of the best, purest and most capable minds. If we return to our first slide, we had the Quran and Sunnah here and the Usul. The Usul here is consistent. He said we have devised the rules we're going to use to derive our rulings from the Quran and Sunnah. They're consistent. We don't choose one rule here, we don't choose another rule in another position. It will be consistent throughout the madhab. You have no chance of being affected by your desires or your opinions because we have our fixed rules that we're going to follow through the madhab. And you know what? It's not just me doing it. It's centuries of people doing it. The whole scholars have been going back over the madhab and studying it and studying it and studying it and refining it. So you have the benefit of generations of people. And even after all of this, we're not saying it's binding on you. What's binding is the Quran and Sunnah. But this is a tool to facilitate you to follow the Quran and Sunnah. Because you have the benefit of generations of scholars who have done this work for you. Now, I want to talk about the qualifications of a mujtahid. This is important because it's come into who is qualified to make ijtihad. Does everybody know what ijtihad is? Ijtihad is deriving a ruling from the source materials. The person who comes uses his usul or his principles of deriving law, applies it to the Quran and Sunnah to come to his conclusion. Now, the qualifications of mujtahid are quite hard, to say the least. He has the mastery of Arabic language. And the scholars used to spend years with the Bedouins just to get pure Arabic language and the grammar. He has the exhaustive knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah, including the reasons of revelation and what they mean, the shuru and the tafsir of the scholars, how the scholars understood the ayahs to mean, and what they understood the hadith to mean. They must know the specialist disciplines of hadith. For example, which hadith is authentic, inauthentic, what issues with it, who are the narrators, how to derive this from first principles. They have to know the views of the scholars, the companions and the followers and the great imams and ijma, consensus on the rulings of fiqh and how they understood these rulings and how they derived their rulings. He has to understand qiyas, or judicial analogy, and its types and conditions. And he needs to know his society and the place he lives. A scholar who doesn't live in the society and doesn't know the situation of the people can't give fatwa because he doesn't understand the situation of the people and the question they're asking. A scholar living in Saudi Arabia will give a different answer to a scholar living in Malaysia because the circumstances are different. A scholar living in a Muslim majority country would give the answer to a question differently to a Muslim living in a minority country. And, most importantly, mostly and very hard, he has to be very smart, intelligent and pious, and have compassion, courtesy and modesty. It's very easy to find your way through law books to find a solution for people or an out. But to have something which is consistent with the intents of the maqasid, the intents of the law, and consistent with the Quran and Sunnah is difficult. And whoever fulfills these conditions is the mujtahid fi shar, and is not permitted, it is prohibited for him to follow an existing madhab. Why? Because he can derive the rules on himself. He doesn't need the crutch, he doesn't need the madhab. It's not allowed for him to follow a madhab. He can basically look at the rulings, and all the rulings he likes, then he'll come to his own conclusion, which may be from any of the madhabs. But he cannot say, I'm a Shafi, I'm stuck to the Shafi madhab. But there's very few of these individuals ever existed in our history. And even the scholars, like, there's other, next category is called Mujtahid fi Madhab. And these are scholars you may have heard of. Imam Nawawi, who wrote Sharh Sahih Muslim, Al-Majmu'ah, Qadi ibn Ad-Dabar for the Malikis, Ibn Abidin for the Hanafis, or Ibn Qudama, who wrote Al-Mughni, a massive collection of comparative fiqh. He was a Hanbali still. Ibn Rushd, who wrote Bidayat al-Mujtahid, comparative fiqh, Maliki. The scholars in our history have generally stayed within a madhab. But as Shaykh Taha Quran said, it's not a fixed thing, you're stuck in this madhab, you can't leave this as a box, you're Hanafi, you're a Shafi, you can't leave this madhab. He said, no, it's a tool to facilitate your following of the Quran and Sunnah. It's a tool to assist you. And Imam Shafi said, if you find a hadith that contradicts my verdict and follow the hadith, it was directed to these scholars, the mujtahideen. He wasn't directed to us, the awam, who can't understand the Arabic, who wouldn't know qiyas, who would never understood the rulings, or don't even know the names of the companions, let alone what their views were on issues. Now people say, why is there only 4 madhabs to follow? Why is there only 4 madhabs? And I know quite a few people, generally Ibn Taymiyyah, because he's taken as being quite antagonistic to following madhabs. And I'll just show you what his actual view was and how he qualified his view and what he thought. There's no difference as far as the Quran and Sunnah is concerned in following one mujtahid and not the other. So following Imam Malik or Imam Layth ibn Sa'ad, Awza'i and Thawri, they were imams of their time. Following any of them was permissible. But nobody's heard of the madhab of Imam Layth or Imam Awza'i or Sufyan al-Thawri nowadays. We have 4 madhabs. Why? No Muslim can say it's permissible to follow one but not the other. However, if anyone's not allowed following any of these scholars, in our times, it's for one of the following 2 reasons. 1, there remains no one who knows that particular Imam's school of thought. That will render the particular scholar or his school of thought dead. There is no students of Imam al-Dhahri around. We have no chain generation back to Ibn Hazm. We have his books. Imam Layth, there's no students of Imam Layth walking around. Or Sufyan al-Thawri, his students didn't derive the madhab. Following these Imams today is like following a dead person, which is not allowed. It would only be valid if knowledge of his school existed. We have a continuous chain narration for the Shafi school, for example, or the Hanafi school, or the Maliki school. The scholars have taught it and derived it continuously, and passed it on one-to-one, orally, and taught it from student to teacher. It's not picking up a book and understanding his book. The second reason he outlines is that the consensus scholars has determined that the opinions which were in the madhabs which had died out prevail today. The other madhabs have taken them and included them in their madhabs. So generally all the opinions you'll find will be found in the madhabs. Don't think that the Shafi madhab is a single view on an issue. You'll have a raji here, the opinion of the madhab. Then you have marjua, opinion which is strong, but not the one we give normal iftar by. You have a marju opinion or a tarji and your weak opinions, but it may be multiple views in the madhab. Imam Ahmed in the Hanbali madhab may have multiple opinions. One saying haram, one saying makruh, one can say mubah on the same issue. And the madhabs in that way have divergence. They allow multiple views on the same issue. And they'll show you that it's not a single answer in some issues. Which means they've captured these views already. But it's on a specialist in that madhab to tell you what is a reliable view in the madhab. And he is the one who's qualified to say, well, we can use this second opinion in the madhab in this issue. Or this opinion is more suitable to our times. Imam Nawawi said, although the knowledge and status of the companions and their companions, the Sahaba and Tabi'een, is far superior to that of any of the scholars who came after them, it is not permissible to follow any of their schools of thought. Why not? Abdullah ibn Umar ibn Masud, the Fuqaha of Medina, the seven Fuqaha. He's saying they know more than any other scholar. They know more than any other scholars in existence. Why? He said that's because they were not able to document the fatwa, nor arrange the principles, their usul, how they derive the madhabs and the school of thoughts. None of the companions or their followers formed a structured school of law like the four we have. The structuring was done by scholars who came after them, who being themselves students of the predecessors, took on the task of formulating premises and rules and deriving the principles of the law and defining the madhab. Imam Dhahabi, who was a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, said, we should believe that four Imams, the two Sufyans, Imam Auza'i, Dawud ibn Zahir, Ishaq ibn Rawahi, and all the Imams are correct. What I came back to, each Imam is correct according to his usul. According to the principles and choices he made and how to make decisions, he is correct. And the non-mujtahid should follow one school, one specific school. It is not permissible to follow the companions and their followers, as noted by Imam Juwayni, since their schools are not documented or organized in court rulings and giving a fatwa. And it's not permissible to follow a non-documented, non-organized school. So why am I talking about this? Everybody says, I want to go back to the Sunnah, I want to go back to the Sunnah. Who's understanding? The four madhabs had the understanding of the Sunnah, and they've defined premises and particulars and how they derive the rulings. So each madhab, each imam, was following the Quran and Sunnah. But the ones that is permissible to follow today are the four in it which exist. But why? Because they've been documented and they've been narrated to us continuously. We have a generation, we understand the rulings, and our teachers can teach us the madhabs and how they're derived. Now I want to cover a couple of issues now, taqleed, ittiba, and how to follow the madhab, and objections to following the madhab. Because it can't be one-sided. Now people say, why is taqleed valid? By taqleed I mean going to somebody, asking their opinion and following it without asking the evidences. You say, okay, for example, what do I need to do for wudu? He says, do this, do this, do this, do this. This is obligatory. But you don't go ask him, what's your dalil from the Quran and Sunnah? You say, okay, that's it. I'm following these rulings. Generally, how we all learn when we're children. We make taqleed of what our parents tell us to follow and how we pray. Now, Ibn Abbas said, Umar ibn Khattab said, O people, if you want to know anything about the Quran, go to Ubay ibn Qab. If you want to know about inheritance, go to Zayd ibn Thabit. If you want to know about fiqh, go to Mu'adh ibn Jabal. Okay? Now, I want to say what's important from this. He says, if you want to know about the Quran, it doesn't say go to the Quran, go to Ubay ibn Qab, because he understands the Quran. He's a specialist. If you want to know about inheritance, go to Zayd ibn Thabit. He understood the ayahs of inheritance. He understood what the rules were. He understood how the case history worked. If you want to go ask about fiqh, go to Mu'adh ibn Jabal. He's a specialist. He's the faqih. He's the one you ask for fatwa. Don't try and drive it yourself. If you're not a specialist, go to the specialists. And Imam Ibn Taymiyyah said, Imam Ahmad used to order the layman to ask fatwa, yustafti. It means the verb to ask fatwa from the Ishaq, Abu Ubaid, and these other scholars. But he would forbid the scholars from his followers, like Abu Dawood, who compiled the Sunnah Abu Dawood, or Uthman ibn Sayyid and Imam Muslim and so, from making taqlid of any scholar. He would say to them, you must refer to the sources, to the book and Sunnah, the Quran and Sunnah. Why? Is he differentiating between the awam, us, the unspecialized person, the person with expertise, And his scholar said, you guys, you're mujtahid. You've reached the level that you can drive it from the Quran and Sunnah. And this is your responsibility to do. But if the other person, no, ask a specialist. Ask the person who knows. Shaykh Chaudry was a person in India, a very famous mujaddid in India, who was taught about reviving the Sunnah in India. And he said, the criticism of taqleed does not apply to the person who acknowledges that he should only follow the Prophet ﷺ's statements. I.e., what the Prophet ﷺ made halal and haram. Not what Imam Abu Hanifa made halal and haram, but what the Prophet ﷺ made halal and haram. But he's incapable, he doesn't possess the knowledge enumerated by the Prophet to do this. Because he can't reconcile the contradictions, which seem to appear in the hadith. He doesn't have a structured method of structuring rulings. So he should follow a pious scholar. He should follow somebody he trusts, Ahl al-Dhikr. And assume that the guy's writing his opinions. He's a learned scholar and he has a consistent methodology. He spent his lifetime in deriving these rulings. And how can you doubt this? We've been doing this for our whole history, Islamic history. Look, I showed from what Umar ibn Khattab said in his khutbah. Now, I want to say the dangers of the other approach. One thing I wanted to mention as an aside was Imam Malik. Imam Malik narrated many hadith in Wacana Malik, but he did not act on them. So he narrated the hadith, but his mother was opposite to the hadith. And they said, why'd you do that? He said, I wanted to write the hadith in my Muwatta Imam Malik, so the people understood that I knew the hadith. But I thought I had a stronger ruling, or a stronger hadith, or a stronger view on this, so I left the hadith. But I was not ignorant of the hadith. And this is the state of the scholars. They understood the hadith. They knew the sunnah better than we did. Now this is an amusing story to an extent, or quite a sad one actually. Sheikh Akram Nadwi is a muhaddith from the UK. He's a Hanafi scholar from Deoband, from Nadwa, which is a school of thought in India. And he said, one of my friends from Pakistan, he's a Hanafi scholar, and his father is a Salafi. He said we visited his father in Pakistan, and he saw his father praying. And he's moving from side to side in the prayer. So he said, Dad, what are you doing? He said, why are you moving from side to side in the prayer? His father said, because the Prophet ﷺ used to move in the prayer. So the guy says, you know what, I've been studying for years, I've never come across this. So the father said, no problem, I'll get the hadith. And he pulls down Sahih Bukhari. And he gets the hadith in Urdu, the translation of the meaning of the hadith. And in Urdu, the hadith says, Hazur Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Halki namaz parta. Now halki is written in Urdu without tashkil, without fatha, dama, qasra. And he read it as hilki, as in the verb to move, when he said the light prayer. And this is a danger we do. If we go to Bukhari, say Bukhari, and take the hadith out in Malay, or take out in English or Urdu, and just read the text without understanding the scholars, what they how they understand the hadith, we act on it, and we think, I know better than Imam Abu Hanifa. I know better than the Mujtahid Imams. This is very dangerous. Because these are some mistakes that can happen. And the status of these scholars is not a small thing. And I realized it's small once I started to study. Once you start to study, you see what the scholars wrote and the conclusions they read. And you spend hours and hours trying to understand a single page of what they're saying. And they come to intricate details, and they have proper understanding of these issues. It was literally the back of their hand, they understand the Quran and Sunnah, and their soul. And they disagreed, no problem they disagreed. But they knew what they were talking about. Now, people say, you know what? I'm not doing taqleed. Because it said, follow that when Allah says in the Quran, the meaning of which is, and when it is said to them, follow that which Allah has revealed, they say, no. Rather we will follow that which we found our fathers upon. This is, they say, even though their fathers do not understand, nor are they guided. This is referred to the people following rabbis, making halal what is haram, making haram what is halal. Now, if you find a single mujtahid imam, or a single scholar, making permitted what is prohibited, with a clear, do you remember the first slide I talked about clear and unclear texts? Direct, sariyah, very clear, and hadith al-Quru is not very clear what it means. You will not find an imam who would ever go against a clear text. Nor will you find an imam who will make prohibited what is permitted or vice versa. And this is what this ayah is referring to. And the Imams are just facilitating and expressing their understanding. And they're saying our understanding is subservient to the Quran and Sunnah, but this is how we understood this message. And the idea of sticking and taqlid, adhering rigidly, refusing to follow anything else, Imam Ibn Qayyim, who was a student of Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, said, this is an ugly innovation which was never claimed by any of the Imams of Islam, while they're the most high in ranking, and knowledge of what Allah and His Messenger obliged the people with. And what is Ibn Qayyim talking about in this state? Taqleed, blind, adherent following, refusing to say, no, this is what Imam Abu Hanifa says, so I'll not listen to anything else. Everything else is invalid. No. I'm following this because this understanding and this is my principles, and I've accepted the usul of this madhab, the way this sheikh has derived his rulings. But that's not to invalidate the other madhabs or their views. A Hanafi scholar said, it's not obligatory on anybody from the Ummah to be Hanafi or Maliki or Shafi or Hanbali. Rather, it is obligatory on everyone, if he is not a scholar, to ask someone for Ahlul Dhikr. And the 4 Imams are from amongst Ahlul Dhikr. What does this mean? He's saying you don't have to follow a madhab, but you must ask a scholar who is from Ahlul Dhikr. And the 4 madhabs are amongst Ahlul Dhikr, the people who know the truth and will know, not the truth, but know the knowledge and are consistent with it and are familiar with it. And I think I'll finish this slide with this Ibn Taymiyyah statement. I know there's a lot of statements I'm saying, but the reason I'm quoting these people is so the ideas they're coming with are important to understanding how we should perceive the issue. When people say Ibn Taymiyyah said don't do this, see exactly what he's saying. When they're saying you should follow a madhab, see exactly what they mean by following a madhab. When they say to you it's haram to follow a madhab, see what they mean by following. Terminology is very important here. For one to follow someone's madhab due to his incapacity, inability to find out from the Sharia rulings from other than him, then it's only permissible and not something obligatory. It's permissible to follow a madhab, not obligatory to follow a madhab. Upon everyone, if it becomes possible to obtain knowledge of the Sharia of different means. Everyone, this is obligatory, to fear Allah to His utmost and seek knowledge of what Allah has made, Allah and His Messenger have ordered for us to do. And so we can basically follow Allah's orders and what His Prophet has ordered us to do. And the madhab is a permissible way of doing this. Not the only way, but a sensible, smart way. Now, I just want to go through one issue about contradictions between the madhab and the hadith. Contradiction between the madhab and the hadith. People come to you and say, you know, the hadith is sahih. Okay? Well, who cares what Imam Shafi said? We have a sahih hadith here. Okay. So how do you reconcile this? How do you say, well, you know what? I want to stay within a madhab. The Shafi, the Hanafi, Maliki madhab. Broadly, I want to remain within this madhab as much as I can. Not because I think it's it is the absolute truth, but I know it's a safe way in that the scholars and generations have derived their rulings this way. And if I follow this madhab, I have an excuse in front of Allah that I've followed a valid opinion. He says, what Imam Shafi states here does not mean that anybody who sees an authentic hadith can say, this is a proper view of the Shafi madhab, and this is correct. I have a sahih hadith, forget what he wrote in his book, this is a view of the madhab. And you can't go and just practice on it upon the apparent or the zahir meaning, what it appears to mean. It is only for the person who possesses the ability of ijtihad, the mujtahid slide we came to. Somebody possesses these qualities, or something close to it, could go and use this hadith to change the madhab. And he is to be reasonably convinced that Imam Shafi didn't know this hadith in the first place, or didn't believe it, or did not know it to be authentic. And as Brother Adli can tell you about hadith, it's easy to say in a hadith, if you've got authentic hadith, it's lots easier to find an authentic chain than to disprove an hadith being authentic. To find a weak hadith, to find a hadith and basically raise the authenticity is an easier process than saying there's no strong chains in this hadith. And this level of knowledge can only be acquired after checking all of Imam Shafi's books, or a similar amount of his works and his students. That means understanding the madhab, to say they don't understand this hadith. And this hadith contradicts it. It means not in this issue, go to the issue, say fine, let's go to the source material in the madhab, and they say For example, lamsa mara. Touching the woman breaks your wudu. Go and read the evidence. Go and read the arguments. Read it completely. Then go and find your authentic hadith and see that they don't know the hadith. Then we can talk. And even says Imam Nawawi, he said this is a difficult condition to fulfill. And very few people can do it. And people said this condition was Imam Shafi, he desisted from practicing many hadith, which he knew, because he had evidence they were abrogated, or the hadith were weak, or they were specific. Imam Ahmad said about Imam Shafi that he's the one who taught us the abrogated from the mansukh, nasikh, mansukh, the abrogating hadith, the specific from the particular. He said, people used to criticize Imam Ahmad for abandoning the circles of muhaddithin. He said, you know, if I leave this scholar, I can get this chain of this hadith with maybe a longer chain. But if I leave Imam Shafi, I will never get this knowledge of usul al-fiqh, how to derive rulings from hadith. Nobody else has this thing. He was the first person who particularized in Risala the principles of usul al-fiqh. Systematically, though the Hanafis disagreed with his methodology, which is another story. So what do? We have in a madhab saying one thing, we have hadith saying something else. What's our choices? We stick to the madhab or we stick to the hadith? Neither's great, is it? If I got the madhab in my hand, I've got this, but the Prophet ﷺ is saying this, what do? But if I follow the hadith, I say, why did Imam Shafi say that then? Was he ignorant? Did he really not know his hadith, which I just found? Is that the case? And Imam Nawawi quotes a solution for this. He says, any Shafi who finds a hadith which goes against his madhab should look into the matter as follows. He gives you a process now. He says, you know what, no problem. You found the hadith, you've got an issue, let's solve the problem. We're not going to say you're stuck in the madhab, we're going to say how to solve your issue you have now. Firstly, if he possesses complete ijtihad, requirements ijtihad, without restriction, fine. In that chapter, in that bab of book, or just that point alone, he can practice the hadith independently. If he knows that issue inside out, and he's the expert in the issue, no problem. Go ahead with the hadith. If he doesn't possess this knowledge, and he then finds it difficult to go against the hadith, you know what? The hadith is here, and it's contradicting the madhab, but it's a hadith. He said, no problem. And he can't find a solution, he can't find a valid reason that Imam Shafi left this hadith. You can follow the hadith with a condition that one of the other mujtahid imams, other Imam Shafi, should have practiced upon it. He's saying that the truth is not just in my madhab. If another scholar, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, or Hanbali, the recognized madhabs, and we've said now that the four madhabs consist of all the valid opinions in Islamic history, if they practice it, no problem, go to another view. If you find the hadith and you feel that's stronger. You're not saying you have to stick to my madhab like glue. Not at all. And that will be a valid pretext for him to leave the madhab of his imam. So we see how they say how you should follow the madhab. We're following the madhab as a tool. We're using it to facilitate us to understand the Quran and Sunnah. It's a tool, not a stick. Now, on to go through itiba versus taqlid. When it says فَسَأَلُوا أَهْلَ ذِكْرٍ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So ask the people of remembrance if you do not know. We're ordered to do this. So we're ordered to ask the people of remembrance. So you say, what do? He says, the scholar says, right, you make wudu like this. No, this breaks your wudu. This is tahir, this is not tahir. This is how you make tayammum. You can go, Shaykh, Jazakallah Khair, can you tell me your evidence? Can you tell me the proof, how I can understand? Not to argue, but to understand where we derive the ruling from. This is ittiba, to follow the evidences. Now there's two categories of following the madhab. The muqallid, the one who makes taqleed, who just follows a madhab because he trusts the scholars. And he doesn't need to know the detailed rulings, reasonings behind it, all of its thousands of rulings. And I'll tell you it's hard. You've got thousands of rulings you're trying to work out how they came to this conclusion. You guys are working, everybody's got to make money, everybody's got family to take care of. How much time do we all have? If we had all of us trying to do this work, nothing would ever get built, nothing would ever happen. So we have to have some people being specialized. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ even said to leave people to teach people and send people to specialist areas to do this. Because not everybody needs to know this knowledge. We need people who have this knowledge. And that is Fard Kafaya obligation upon us. But at the same point, you have pious people doing this and you trust them and you follow them. And the muttabi, this is what we should aspire to do. The one who follows the madhab, but he's aware of the dalil, the Quran, the hadith, and the ijma, the reasoning behind his positions. So he learns the madhab, he learns the Shafi madhab, he says, why do they say this? Because this ayah, because this hadith. They've understood it like this. Not the detailed level that he can reach ijtihad, or he can draw the rulings himself, but he understands, he's familiar with the rulings. And to be honest, that's all the only level we can really achieve. We will make ittaba of any mujtahid. We pick a book up and we say like, why do you pray this way? Because it says so in such and such book. Okay, so you're making taqleed of the scholar. No, I'm making ittiba. I'm following the evidence of this scholar, following his understanding of the Quran and Sunnah. But why follow this scholar and leave a madhab, leave thousands and thousands of scholars who've been doing this work already? Generally, we start in the first category. When I tell Sufyan sitting in the front row, my son, how to pray, he prays this way. He doesn't ask me why. Hopefully later he'll go and read the book and work it out. Or when your children follow you for work out how to pray, they look at you how to pray and they follow you. They make taqleed of you. This is how we learn. We hope to move into a better stage, that we understand the rulings better. But it's a matter of trust. And we need to have trust of our scholars. And the mujtahid issue was that he needed to be pious and trustworthy. And often you see something, the guy come with brilliant evidence, he'll knock you out of his proof, yeah? But your heart's not easy. Because there's something about the person, he doesn't leave you comfortable. You don't think, has this person, does he fear Allah in his fatwa he's given me? You understand? So sometimes your heart's uneasy. So it's also a matter of trust. Because let's face it, we're not familiar with the Quran and Sunnah. We're not capable of driving things ourselves. So we need to trust the person we're learning from. We're coming to the conclusion now, so it shouldn't be too long. I want to split the fiqh into various types of fiqh. Fiqh al-ibadat. Okay, firstly, the madhahib, they're crystallized, they're written down in an agrarian society. In a feudal society, which is different to one we live in today. I think they said that the prophets came back, the only place they recognized on the face of the earth is Yemen. We have like steel, we have roads, we have internet, trading, we have things going on, we have all types of contracts. Practices are different. We have issues like Skype, can you talk things, is it khulwa, chat rooms, these things weren't discussed. But the scholars, surprisingly enough, did discuss lots of issues which are very similar to these. And the scholars nowadays are mining these books in fiqh to drive rulings from their views. We studied, for example, DNA and genetics in fiqh. And the scholars used books from the Hanafi fiqh times to work out things like surrogate parenting. Something you never thought of existing at that time, but they thought about issues similar to it, which they could derive rulings from, and they defined the principles. Anyway, if we say fiqh al-ibadat, this is our individual worship. Som, zakat, tahara, hajj. Generally, this is individual worship. This is how you worship. This hasn't changed ever. And you should try to stay as much as you can within one madhab for these issues. Only because you know, not because it's the truth, absolute truth and all the other madhabs are wrong, but you know this is consistent methodology that derive these rulings from the Quran and Sunnah. And it's not pick and mix. It's not, well, nasi kando, if you go to pick a bit of this and that. It's not like this. You're trying to make a specific methodology to come to a conclusion. Fiqh mu'amalat is much harder to do. Because the transactions have changed. And the scholars we have today, and we've got fiqh councils driving rulings on murabaha, BBA. Is it BBA or BBI? BBI, I can't remember which one it was here. Different terminology here. Ijara. They draw the Tuareg, they're all discussing these things over here. And they're driving rulings. And this is the responsibility of the fuqaha in our day to do this, and their responsibility. Fiqh al-janayat, it's what's the criminal laws and criminal punishment. This is what the ruler does. There's no point you discussing this because you're not going to get into this unless you're becoming the king or recently. And the marriage and divorce laws, this is what the scholars do themselves. You go to the qadi, says you're married, you're divorced. This is how your inheritance derived. And they may follow something outside your madhab. And I'll give you an example now, 3 talaqs. The four madhabs all say that 3 talaqs issued in one sitting is 3 talaqs. And this is the Shafi view. And this is what they give iftar in Yemen on. My teacher is a Yemeni scholar from the Shafi madhab. He said this is what we give iftar in Yemen on. But in the UK, no. They say they follow Ibn Taymiyyah's view. And they follow in Egypt Ibn Taymiyyah's view that it counts as 1 talaq. Why? Because they see the value in trying to keep families together. and this is the opinion they follow. You don't have to agree with this, but this is the qadi, this is his job. So, for ourselves, our most important thing we live on day-to-day is fiqh al-ibadat, which we're responsible for. And in general, we should try to remain in one madhab for this. Not exclusively. For example, I'll give you an example of wiping socks. The four madhabs say that the socks can't be wiped. Like cloth socks, if they can't be, the Shafi school makes a ruling that you have to walk around on it. Fulfill your daily business. So you can go to the market for half an hour, walk around, and come back. Now, I don't know how many socks can do that with requirements. But if you live in the West, and we don't have wudu areas like you do in Malaysia, and if your boss walks in and you've got your feet in the sink again, making wudu, it's going to cause problems at work, and everybody in general follows the view that you can wipe your socks. Most people. So the scholars in the area say, we know this ruling, and we would take this opinion, even though it's not from our madhabs, because of the situation of the people in this area. And this is the responsibility of fuqaha. So in conclusion, whilst it is not obligatory to follow one of the four madhabs, it is obligatory to follow the people of knowledge and qualified knowledge, unless you are yourself a mujtahid. If you're going to follow the conclusions of a mujtahid, it is wiser to follow a school which has had generations of scholars refining and crystallizing its fiqh and deliberating its opinions, opposed to a DIY approach or a modern day scholar without an usul, which is based on the four madhabs, irrespective of how brilliant he is. Because you've got one brilliant person, fine, he's a genius. But it's not thousands of people checking his work. It's not generations of people going through point by point and arguing the intricacies and spending pages and volumes on small, intricate fiqh issues that don't even occur to you. Modern day fiqh issues which arise today are best resolved by fiqh councils, where the best scholars of our generations deliberate and meet to guide the community forward. Talfiq is a risky proposition and can invalidate your actions, so it's best handled with caution. Talfiq means taking an opinion from one madhab and taking an opinion from another madhab in the same act of worship. So your act of worship is not valid in either madhab. So for example, the Hanafis say you don't need intention. So you basically don't have intention for your prayer, for you making wudu, but then you pray in a way of the Shafi's pray, which doesn't. I'll give you better examples if you want to. We've got that issue, but it depends on your Q&A. But it's basically invalidating action in two madhabs. But following an opinion in one madhab, on one part of the action, and following an opinion in another madhab in the same part of the action. So your action is not valid in either madhab. If you want to, I can go through that issue, but I'll open the floor first. Any questions? No problem. The slides are on the computer. I think you can get a copy from Adli, inshallah. Any other questions? For a layman, that's what it is. It's recommended. You need to follow Ahlul Dhikr. You need to follow a qualified scholar. And it's better if the qualified scholar is from Madhab, because you know then that there's been thousands and hundreds of scholars going through the rulings to derive those rulings. It's not something he came up with himself, or a few scholars came up with this point of view or just died off. We know that it's been thousands of scholars coming to these rulings, so we know we're playing safe, especially for a layman. What does that statement mean? If I say I don't follow madhab, who do I follow? Does it mean I go and get the Quran and I go and read it and then make the rulings? Who does he follow to pray? How does he pray? But what does that mean? He gets hadith. Who's understanding the Sunnah does he follow? I don't think he goes there and reads Imam Bukhari's Bab Salah and says, right, I'm going to pray this way. If he does that, he's an idiot, to be honest with you, because there's so many hadith not in that book. Unless he has exhausted knowledge of all the hadith on that issue. Sorry? A stage? He says that he's not, but he won't. Generally, the ruler, he's not a scholar. Very few rulers are scholars. If he's a scholar, he's a mujtahid. If he's not a scholar, he's going to ask the specialists. And the scholars in general will be following a madhab. Yes, some people say I don't follow the madhab. Imam Shawkani, for example, he was Zaydi and he left that. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah used to be a Hanbali. And if you look at the law in Saudi Arabia, it's generally the Hanbali Mazhab with the views of Ibn Taymiyyah, the Tarjih of Ibn Taymiyyah in it. But in generally you follow a Mazhab, be it of a scholar or a school of thought. I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question, but it's hard. Sorry, go on. Okay. Okay.
So, for Malaysian, I would say it is sufficient to leave this institution for any clarification.
Sure. If they're trustworthy scholars and you trust them and they're fit counsel, why not? If they're Ahl al-Dhikr, if you believe the people, the scholars in this council qualify as Ahl al-Dhikr, the people of knowledge, follow them. If you don't trust them or you disagree with the conclusion, we have a process to reconcile that. You're not bound, it's not you have to follow a scholar blindly. But the same point is when you ask a scholar for fatwa, it's permissible to follow his opinion. And they say the layman has no madhab. And the statement means something. The layman has no madhab. It means he follows whichever scholar he asks. If he goes to a scholar from Africa and he's Maliki, and the Maliki scholars do this, do this, do this, he's following that madhab. He's following the scholar madhab of that scholar. He doesn't have to say, sorry, are you a Shafi before he asks a fatwa from him. Because he's a layman. And the layman has excuse. He's following qualified opinion. We're not required to find the absolute truth. We cannot find what the absolute truth is. But we're required to follow Ahl al-Dhikr and to have a valid excuse in front of Allah. So, I followed this opinion. I thought it was the truth. I trusted the person giving me this opinion. We're not capable of finding the absolute truth. The scholars differed. How can we reach a conclusion? But we need to feel like we've been ordered to fear Allah as much as we can. Any other questions? Okay, I got a slide for Talfiq. So should I go for Talfiq? Okay. I just want to see how much time I had first. Sure. I have a slide prepared for Talfiq, but I took it out because I didn't know how much time I had. Now, Talfiq means selecting various opinions in a specific issue from different madhabs and combine them in such a way that the result is considered invalid in the sight of all madhabs. An example, to make wudu, wiping only part of the head. The Shafi say you need to wipe 3 hairs, because that is the smallest plural. And then to touch a woman without desire, whilst believing that his wudu is still valid. The Maliki opinion. The Maliki say you need desire to be associated with touching. However, the Malikis also say you have to wipe the entire head. And the Shafi view is that if you touch a woman, irrespective of desire, your wudu is broken. So your wudu is invalid in terms of Malikis and the Shafis. This is Talfiq. You've taken 2 opinions on that issue. And if you combine them in that act of worship, it's invalid according to both madhabs. Do you understand the example? Okay. Now the majority of scholars, Allah scholars have prohibited Talfiq from the Malikis, Shafis and Hanbalis. Absolutely. But the Hanafis allowed it. Some of the Hanafis allowed it. Most of them. The Hanafis allowed Talfiq based on the phenomenon of Talfiq not existing at the time of the companions. They're saying, you know what, you could ask fatwa for anybody then. Nobody said you had to follow one scholar. We've just said the layman's madhab is a layman. He has no madhab, he follows whoever he asks fatwa from. And the many occasions when a companion would be asked an issue, and he would not forbid the person asking fatwa from seeking fatwa from other than him. He didn't say, look, if you follow this on me and how to pray, you've got to follow all I'm saying about praying. You can't go and ask another scholar who will contradict me. So he said it's not prohibited in the Quran and Sunnah, so how can you prohibit it now? And they say, look, the scholars use Talfiq as well. The Imams used to pray behind one another. For example, despite them holding different opinions concerning the validity of each other's wudu. They say, you know what? I don't think your wudu is valid because you're Hanafi and you've made wudu in a certain way. But I'll still pray behind you. And they say, you know, they're accepting differences. And they say a layman, he would ask many scholars, many muftis, and he doesn't know what the mufti's madhab is. And he'd basically ask him one issue in prayer, another issue in prayer. And it's not consistent, it's not one madhab is asked from. Which may result in talfiq. And nobody said the actual worship are invalid. So there's a disagreement on talfiq. But like I said, go back to the first slide, go back to the conclusion, when I said that following a consistent set of principles is safer. Because you know you're understanding the ruling the same way. So I'm saying it's generally better to stay within one madhab, because you know then that the rulings for that to worship are consistent. They don't have the risk of talfiq, which the Shafis prohibit anyway. The second slide on this issue is called Tatabu Rukhas, whereas where talfiq really comes into play. And those who permitted talfiq, the Hanafis, do not allow all of its types and stipulate strict conditions in allowing to merge opinions. They prohibited it when the end result is in itself haram, i.e. alcohol, fornication. An example given is marrying without a guardian. Everybody knows the Hanafis say you don't need a wali. Or in the UK they do. The Hanafis say you don't need a wali. And the Malikis say you don't need any witnesses. So if you marry a woman without a guardian and no witnesses, it's essentially fornication, but you just done talfiq and you basically got a conclusion which is that you're permitting something which is prohibited. So they don't allow it. Or you go around through the books trying to find the most lenient opinions from the madhabs. There's quite an interesting saying, like the scholar, some people like Imam Ibn Hazm's opinion on music. They say no, he said it's mubah, it's allowed. So the scholar say no problem. If you're going to follow Imam Ibn Hazm, he says all your prayers have to be in the masjid. Are you going to pray every single prayer in the masjid too? Are you going to follow him in everything he says, or just the ones you like? And Imam Ahmad said, if a person was to act upon the opinions of the people of Kufa in Iraq, who allowed nabith, they didn't prohibit all types of alcohol. They permitted some source of alcohol not from dates and grapes. Okay? And the Hanafis even say I think it's makruh tahrimi in their madhab for certain types of alcohol, like beer. There's interesting ruling they have on certain types of alcohol and where it comes into it. Because they said the prohibition in text, qati prohibition, I'm not quite sure of that issue, but they said the qati prohibition is on grapes and dates. And the opinion of Medina, permissibility of music. This is Imam Ahmed speaking now. And the opinion of the people of Makkah in allowing mutta, following Ibn Abbas's opinion, and temporary marriage, he would be considered fasik because he basically found every single ruqsa he can do and combined it in such a way to make his life easy. Not because of the evidence, just because he said, you know, I've got a valid opinion, I can do it, mish mushkila, let's go ahead. If somebody said it's alright, let's do it. And we've been told to fear Allah as much as we can. And we've got to say, is following ruqsa, tatabu ruqas, is that consistent with fearing Allah as much as we can? And the scholar Sulaiman al-Taymi said that if you were to follow the allowances of every scholar, all the evil will be gathered in you. And Ibn Taymiyyah said that if it is allowed for the layman, the one who's not capable of ijtihad, to make taqleed of whomsoever he wishes, then the statements of our Hanbali scholars indicate that it is not permissible, it's prohibited for him to seek and follow adherences in any other circumstances. To follow allowances in other circumstances. It's not allowed for you to go for ruqsa. If you're going to follow a madhab. But don't go around trying to collect all your tatabu ruqas, which is what the danger talfiq leads to. And even the majority of who allow it, the Hanafis, only allow in certain situations, in personal extreme hardship or a person afflicted with constant wiswas and so and so. They don't just allow it, go ahead and do it. They allow it as a gate, as an exit for people who find difficulties. Is that better for talfiq? Is that a bit clearer now? Okay. Any other questions?
I would like to believe that this period, this era, it's easier for you to get information. For example, on some issues that you find out in book, for example. There are books that you can read. There are you can go to the internet and just get hadith, issues, get opinions from various scholars on the issue. You can say
Okay.
Comparing, for example, 500 years ago, where it's difficult for you to get information with curriculum study, process. So on that basis, I'm not saying that we should not follow Mazhab. I feel that this current era, that what information you can gather, you can come to a certain conclusion. For example, on the touching of women,
Yeah.
there have been a study on it. There
Sure.
is also a study on where Allah touched Malaysia, continue praying. There is a
And the Shafi say that's because he touched her, and the Hadith they say it's because through her jilbab, the way she was sleeping, she was covered. It didn't skin touching.
But at the end of the day, it's not that you want to find the simple, be most lenient, but it's also about convenience. For example, if you want to strictly follow Shafi'i, you're driving a car and you're driving, you start your wife, oh, I'm Shafi'i and I want to start. But then I can go take my duty.
Only if you need to wudu to drive your car. Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
You have one thing to say.
I understand exactly what you're saying. But it's interesting you chose the word information. The difference between information and understanding. It's not possible to pick up Bukhari and understand Bukhari. Bukhari is a very, very hard book. Very hard book to understand. And it's very hard to understand what the scholars understood the rulings to be from these books. And a lot of information, you're lost in a sea of information, but you have no guidance. And that's a problem. You see contradictory views based on the same texts, and we don't have the expertise to be able, generally, to understand and make a decision. Like the example I gave you was an example of that. He said, you know, I've got a hadith, what do I need to follow this Imam Shafi's view for? You don't. You don't have to be a Shafi. Nobody's saying it's binding upon you. But it's safer to follow a consistent madhab. If you want to leave it, no problem. Nobody's saying you have to be it. You can't oblige somebody to follow a madhab when Allah and the Messenger didn't oblige you to follow a madhab. But you've been obliged to ask Ahl al-Dhikr if you follow a qualified opinion. But the question comes back to, who's a qualified opinion? When you read something and you do a Google search, and you come back to, and you don't know who's written the article. You don't know. It's Abu Fulan from here. Okay, you find as a 13-year-old child cutting and pasting articles together. Because that's what a lot of teenagers do. They find random things, cut and paste together. And you're not following Ahl al-Dhikr.
I'm not saying that you just take any opinion or come of many scholars.
Sure, you can do. But in general, do you need to do this for every issue? Maybe, for example, you give an example of touching. There's a marju opinion in the Shafi madhab. I know this because my teacher was talking about it when he tried to make tawaf. Markaz Yemeni, the Shafi scholar, is quite strict on his madhab. He said, you know what, I'm going to try and make tawaf on the Shafi madhab. So he's making tawaf, and somebody touches him. He said, I'm not going to look around, because then it's still done. I don't know if it's man or woman, and my wudu is still valid. So he carries on working. And he says, and he tries to avoid the woman. And then somebody touches him, and because he's walking slowly, he goes, Ya bunay. And it's a woman's voice, so he knows a woman's touched him now. And he says, okay, I'll follow the marju opinion, not the main opinion, the other opinion. That the one who's touched, the wudu is still valid, but the toucher's wudu is invalid. And he's not saying he's denying, it's hard to say. And then you follow the Maliki opinion that says it involves shahwa. So nobody's saying you can't do this for necessity. And the job of the mufti to come, the job of the mufti is to give guidance to people. To say this is a Shafi opinion, but you can follow this ruqsa, you can follow the other madhab in this issue. For example, vending machines. When you go and put your 1 ringgit 20 to buy a can of Coke, it's haram in the Shafi madhab. Because they say the part of contract law is siga, the terminology. So unless a vending machine is going to say to you, do you agree to buy the can of Coke can fee? You can't do it. So you follow the Hanafi madhab in this issue. Nobody's saying you follow it blindly. But I'm saying generally in ibadah actions, if you can, broadly it's better to follow that. Not because it's the truth, but because you know you're safe. Do you see what I'm saying? You can follow the issue, but is it a massive issue? You can follow the Marju opinion generally, you can follow the Maliki opinion, no problem. But even then he said you're remaining within the madhabs, you're remaining within a valid opinion as school of thought. The danger is when you come and say to you know what, I've got this hadith, so forget everything else, here's a hadith. He said, no, don't do that. Go and find a madhab which agrees with the view you're following, then okay. Then I can say you're following this issue, on this issue because of hardship or necessity. For example, there's a book called Reliance of the Traveller, which is the English translation of Salik. If you read it, it's a Shafi book. But he'll come and he'll say, this is a Hanafi section on this book for rukhsa. because it's hard to follow this nowadays. So you can follow the Hanafi opinion. The teachers, scholars allow you to follow this on this ruqsa for vending machines, for example, or they may discuss other issues in the madhab where it's hard, or the Shafi opinion is very, very difficult to follow in modern days. I'm saying generally, but follow qualified scholarship. Don't come to me with a hadith and say, I want to follow the hadith, because you're not a person qualified to do that. If the qadi comes with a fatwa, you can do it. Is that okay? Any other questions? Which one? Which? Nabith. Not wine, but nabith. Nabith means alcohol not made from dates or grapes. Because the text specifically says dates and grapes, yeah? We know the hadith says it's prohibited for dates, yeah? We know that, and grapes are done for grapes and grapes, so there's definite text against that. But then we have another hadith when the man came, he said, we make this drink, is it permissible to drink? And the Prophet said, does it intoxicate you? He said, yeah, then it's haram. So we know the reason for prohibition is intoxication. But nabith, they say if you drink a little bit of nabith, it warms you up. Don't ask me what it means, but apparently it warms you up. But only if you drink a lot does it become intoxicated. So I said, well, it's not from grapes, it's not from dates, okay? It doesn't make you intoxicated unless you drink a lot of it. So it's not definitely prohibited. You understand? You find a lot of these discussions in fiqh issues. Okay? Permissible in music. Okay, music is a massive, massive discussion in itself. Water? No. What happened was, and we covered this last year, Ibn Abbas had the opinion allowing mutta in certain situations. Okay? His view was that mutta was allowed twice and it's prohibited finally. That's the opinion of the majority of the scholars. He allowed it in certain situations, and then the people took this fatwa out of context and allowed it for person generally. And he said, I allowed mutta like you allow the drinking of wine and the eating of pig in dire necessity. And I didn't allow it generally. And this is, I think, in Tafsir Qurtubi. If you really want, I can get the quote for you where it is. Because we covered this in university. So he allowed it in certain circumstances. People generalized it. And there's big disagreement. And from earlier in his life, he allowed the opinion. Earlier, before his death, he allowed mutta and he changed his view later on. But I'm saying to you, if you go through fiqh books, it can do your head in really, because there's so many contradictions, there's so many funny views. And not funny views, but they say we don't teach this view to the people. We don't teach this view to the people, because it's not relied upon view. And there's many issues like this. But you can find a view validating lots of things. But it's not a safe view to follow. I think your wife would agree with that. Any other questions?
So what is the best solution to teach general people fiqh? What is the best solution? Why? Because we find nowadays so many people, they go to the internet, they Google, and they have their own books of fiqh. So how do we deliver fiqh to them?
We have many multiple opinions, for example. We have, for example, many imams coming to conclusions. Each person's got his own school of thought. We say to it's fine, you can follow this person, but you need to ask yourself, firstly, you're not deriving this understanding of fiqh yourself. You're following the author of this book. So who is the author of this book? Who did he learn from? And how is he deriving his opinions? How do you know it's reliable? How do you know his understanding is correct? Who did he learn from? So if you're following somebody just randomly, you don't know who he is it a safe person to follow? Are you fulfilling obligations? The reason I said the four madhabs, for example, is because you know these madhabs have a set of principles to drive rulings. Say, look, nobody's saying it's haram what you're doing, because nobody can oblige you to follow a madhab. But it's safer and more, it's more harasan, it's more careful for your hereafter. And if you don't want to follow a madhab without asking evidence, don't worry, the madhab's evidences. I'll go back a few slides. The Hanafis are accused of not following hadith. Everybody's heard this? Imam Abu Hanifa didn't know any hadith. Rubbish. Imam Abu Hanifa was very strict with hadith, accepted a very small minority of hadith because of the amount of forgeries in Kufr at that time. Very lot of forgeries around. So he rejected many hadith, which other scholars allowed, because he was very strict on hadith. But these are all books discussing the evidence for the Hanafi madhab for their actual worships and their fiqh. The first book by Imam Tahawi, Shawmani al-Athar, he'll go through hadith evidence for the madhab. So if somebody says, you want to follow Quran and Sunnah, no problem. Go to the books for the madhab, they'll bring you the evidence. I was speaking to my friend today, he's doing work for the Shafi madhab now, to go through Matab Bishuj and annotate it with the evidence from other books, for the proofs for the acts of worship. All of them are following Quran and Sunnah. I say to you, no problem. You follow the scholar you want to follow, but is he the most qualified person to take from? Is he qualified for what he claims to be? Was he actually a muhaddith? Who did he study from? And if we say we're taking our religion for somebody, it's a trust, and we've got to be very careful who we take our knowledge from. Are you being careful by reading this book or trusting what's in this book? Is it haris? And this is what I'll say to you. And I think in generally Malaysia, it's a Shafi country and there's nothing wrong with following the Shafi madhab in general. And the Shafi madhab is one which is closer in terms of following the explicit Adhahir texts than one of the other, apart from the Hanbali madhab. There's no really issues between conflicts between the hadith and the madhab.
Your opinion on
Who am I to have an opinion? But no. As far as I know, the fatwa from Azhar is haram. The scholars prohibited it in Azhar, and then the mufti was removed the next day because he banned smoking, because it is haram. I think the Hanafi ruling is makruh tahrimi. I'm not sure the Shafi ruling, but we have to live our life by taqwa, not by fatwa. If you're trying to follow the fatwa, trying to find somebody saying it's halal for you to smoke, that's not really the way how we're supposed to live our lives. We know it's not good for us, so we try to avoid it. If I want to say music's halal, no, it's halal, this scholar did it, this scholar did it, okay, fine. But you know the music's still going to kill your heart. It's still going to make it hard if you concentrate on your prayer. It's still going to make you forget the Quran you memorized. So we don't live our life just by following the fatwa. But we live by taqwa, and this is what we should aim to do. So the ruling of the scholars is there. And I don't know any modern scholar which says it's makruh tanzi. As far as I know, they'll say it's makruh tahrimi. The Hanafi makruh tahrimi is the same as haram for the Shafis. Okay? They divide makruh into tahrimi tanzi. Like the alcohol example, they say the evidence is not direct, it's not sarihah, but it's almost there. So we say it's makruh tahrimi. You're sinful for doing it. So they say, well, nobody said smoking is haram in the Quran. You can't find hadith saying it's haram to smoke tobacco. So we can't say it's haram, we can say it's makruh tahrimi. Can we eat meat slaughtered by al-Kitab? Why is this an issue in Malaysia when all the meats are imported? And you've got big halal stamps on your water. Well, even the water's halal here. Generally, the problem is the meat slaughtered by al-Kitab is valid if the person slaughtered according to their laws, their dietary rules. Kosher meat, for example, is slaughtered by proper kosher meat slaughtered by Jews practicing their shikita, their type of slaughtering. They slaughter the neck, they mention the name of God, etc. Christians in general in the West don't follow this methodology. You don't know if you've got a Christian or an atheist, a Hindu or a Sikh slaughtering your meat. So it's hard to say Ahl Kitab is slaughtering your meat. For example, if a Chinese person is slaughtering your meat, would you eat it? A Buddhist? I only eat halal meat. I only eat halal meat from a halal butcher or zabiha meat. I don't eat McDonald's in the West. Unless they say it's halal, I wouldn't eat the meat. Or I know the meat's halal. And in general in the West, we don't do that. Some of the Gulf Arabs do. They say it's halal because Ahl Kitab. But to view the Europe as a Christian country is a mistake. Because it's really an atheist country, generally more than anything else. There's a very good book in this in English by Mufti Taqi Uthmani, by White Thread Press, I think, which discusses in great depth. More than I can cover. But I wouldn't. There's enough halal meat you can buy anywhere. There's a website called zabiha.com. You can find a halal restaurant pretty much wherever you are. And I think we eat a lot of meat as well sometimes, my wife tells me, so maybe we can have some tuna for a while.
Sorry, talking about Europe countries. Do they kill the cows or something? They even slaughter it. In general, I mean, they can't.
Their problem is the slaughter in the West, they use stunning. They use electroshock stunning for cows. There's two ways of killing a cow. They shoot it in the head with a bolt. It's called a captive bolt, which basically kills the animal with brain damage. That's haram from a slaughter. And the issue was that's not halal slaughter. So, for example, if a Christian comes away and shoots the animal in the head with a gun, it's not halal way of slaughter. It's not slaughtering according to their dietary laws, which is more the issue. So, for example, a Muslim, he slaughters the animal incorrectly. The meat's not halal because he's killed it incorrectly. If it doesn't cut, for example, the two arteries, the artery and the vein. So if a Christian doesn't follow his rules, why would it be any more permissible? So yeah, but this issue in that book, White Threads Press, Mufti Taqi discusses in great depth. I forget the name, but it's, if you search for the book on slaughtering, I think it's the name is escaping me right now, but Taqi Usmani, it's on the internet, I've seen it in PDF online. Maybe in Kalam Allah, I think the website was on that. But there'll be a book on it. There's a book on this issue. A lot of research has been translated on this. It's in English. Any other questions? Do the sisters have any questions? Anybody falling asleep?
One more question.
Go on.
I mean, so what's the best way for laymen or people who don't have a big amount of knowledge? So just to follow one ustad or one sheikh to avoid confusion, and if he goes to this sheikh and after that he goes to that sheikh, maybe there will be few opinions regarding one masala. So what is the best way for that?
In general, you're going to, like we said beforehand, the awam has no madhab. The general person has no madhab. So you can ask fatwa from any qualified person. If your ustad is a qualified person, ask him.
Even in one masala.
But why would you ask, if you have a fatwa and he says it's haram, it's okay. You ask somebody else to find a halal opinion, is that what you're saying? I don't understand what you're saying. Is that what you're saying? You're trying to find a ruling saying it's permissible? In general, you don't need to ask multiple. You ask one time for iftar, you follow the fatwa you're given. If you're not convinced by his knowledge or you don't trust his understanding, ask somebody else. But at the same time, the tabarrus, don't try and find just some fatwa, somebody saying maybe it's allowed just so you can do it. Okay?
But I think the issue is not more on halal haram. For example, there are various opinions like Ahlul Kitab. Some scholars say this person, Christian, says no. But in Malaysia,
Okay. If you're convinced by the argument, people say Ahl Kitab, follow that opinion. If you're not convinced, follow the other opinion. But is this just an issue about meat? Is it really is the issue about marriage now or meat now? Marriage. Most modern scholars don't advise marrying from Ahl Kitab, in the West at least anyway, because you can't guarantee because one of the conditions is your children need to be brought up as Muslims. And it's hard to bring up children as Muslims in a Muslim household, let alone when one of the spouses is not Muslim. Any other questions? Shall we end then? Anything else? سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.
Thank you, Brother Imran, for that.